Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. This week we are still dealing with women in the Old Testament. This time we will deal with stories that feature the sisters, Leah and Rachel, as well as their two maids, Bilhah and Zilpah. The latter two women are seldom featured as important women, but they were mothers of significant children of the patriarch Jacob and therefore deserve at least an honorary mention. The story of these women begins in Genesis 29. Though she was the younger sister, she is the first woman to make an appearance in this strategic section of the biblical account. Because Jacob had managed to make himself odious to his older brother, for his safety, Isaac had sent him to Mesopotamia. That's in chapter 28, verse 1. While there, he was to acquire a wife from one of Laban's daughters. Laban was, of course, Rebekah's brother. Jacob was supposed to marry one of his cousins. When he arrived at the territory occupied by Laban's family, Jacob happened on to a spring. Springs were often places where romance blossomed. Jacob spoke to some shepherds who were watering their flocks at the well. He wanted to know whether they were acquainted with his uncle Laban. They not only said that they knew the man, but as it turned out, one of his daughters, namely Rachel, was heading for the spring to water the sheep which she tended. When Jacob saw Rachel and her sheep, he rolled the stone away that would allow the water to flow. This allowed Rachel to water the sheep immediately. Jacob was thrilled to contact his kin, as shown by the fact that he kissed the woman and wept. Then he told her who he was, at which point she ran to tell her father the news. The uncle was more than pleased that his nephew was visiting. After Jacob had stayed with the family for a month, his uncle determined that his nephew should not be helping out without being paid. So he asked Jacob what he might require as a wage. In that same month, Jacob had been smitten with Rachel, who was beautiful and lovely. Her elder sister, Leah, was not as attractive. This led Jacob to make an offer. He would agree to work for his uncle for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. Laban accepted this offer, and Jacob went to work. The 7 years went by in a flash. That's in verses 15 through 20 of chapter 29. Famously, the honeymoon first evening did not go as Jacob had planned. To his astonishment, in the morning Jacob looked at his new wife and realized he had just slept with Leah, not Rachel. When Jacob deceived his father into thinking that he was Esau, at least his father had the excuse of being old and decrepit. Jacob had no such excuse. He was in the prime of life. Yet in his passion he did not recognize that he had another woman in his bed. Of course, Jacob protested that his father-in-law was behind this switch. Laban's response was that, in his culture, one would not marry off a younger sister before an older one. But if he was willing, Laban said that Rachel could also be Jacob's wife, that is, if he was willing to serve another 7 years. That's in verses 21 through 30 of chapter 29. In the end, Jacob took the two sisters as his wives, even though he loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. That made for tense familial situations, to say the least. Indeed, when God saw that Jacob had in fact hated Leah, the deity decided to even the score a little. God saw to it that Leah conceived easily. However, Rachel was barren. So, right off the bat, Leah bore Jacob his first 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. She named all 4 sons. That's in verses 31 through 35 of chapter 29. For the time being, Leah was very much enjoying her marriage. In a patriarchal culture, her ability to name every son without any interference from her husband is quite telling. The fact that Leah had borne Jacob his first 4 sons sent Rachel into a tizzy. She blurted out to Jacob that if he did not make her pregnant, she was ready to die. Jacob pointed out that he was not God. How could he ensure her pregnancy? But Rachel had a contingent plan. When she got married, her father had given her a maid, a woman named Bilhah. A maid of a primary wife could easily serve as a secondary wife in a polygamous society. Thus, Rachel insisted that Jacob sleep with Bilhah to compensate for the fact that she could not get pregnant. Jacob did as Rachel commanded. This resulted in Jacob's 5th son. Even though the son was biologically related to Bilhah, Rachel nevertheless named the child. That was not the only time Jacob slept with Bilhah, however. Soon this same maid bore Jacob's 6th son. Once again, though, Rachel named the child. It was as though Bilhah was merely a surrogate. That's in the first 8 verses of chapter 30. It turns out that Laban had given both his daughters maids. When Leah saw that Bilhah had borne Jacob 2 sons, she figured that 2 could play the same game. She gave her maid, a woman named Zilpah, to Jacob as a secondary wife. This resulted in 2 successive pregnancies and 2 more sons. Just as she had done with her first 4 sons, Leah named those 2 babies as well. Nothing is said about Jacob's participation in the naming of his first 8 sons. That's in verses 9 through 13 of chapter 30. The rivalry between Leah and Rachel only intensified. One day, the firstborn son, Reuben, found some special plants in the field. These plants were called mandrakes. Though Reuben brought the plants to his mother, Leah, Rachel noticed this. Out of the blue, Rachel asked Leah to share the mandrakes with her. Leah was affronted by this request. She regarded Rachel's request as a stab in the back. Indeed, she equated the request with Rachel's taking her husband, likely a reference to the fact that Jacob loved Rachel, something apparently that he made obvious. But Rachel wanted the mandrakes badly. If Leah would give them, or at least some of them, to her, then she would see to it that Leah slept with Jacob that evening. When Jacob came from the field after work, Leah met him and told him that she had effectively bought the privilege of sleeping with him that very evening. Obviously, Leah's purchasing the rights to sleep with Jacob was not a one-time affair. This bizarre arrangement ended up in Leah's becoming pregnant twice. She provided Jacob with his 9th and 10th sons. As well, she provided Jacob with his only daughter. As before, Leah named these 3 children. That's in verses 14 through 21 of chapter 30. At long last, God took pity on Rachel so that she was able to conceive. She finally had a child, a son, Jacob's 11th son and 12th child. As was the pattern in that family, Rachel had the honor of naming the child. That's in verses 22 to 24 of chapter 30. After this happened, Jacob went to Laban and told him that he was planning to take his family and go back home. But Laban did not want to lose his son-in-law, who had been a boon to business. He concocted a story that God had communicated to him that he had been blessed because of Jacob. In an effort to induce Jacob to stay, Laban asked his son-in-law to name his wage. That had happened once before, with disastrous results for Jacob. Nevertheless, he took the bait and made an arrangement with his father-in-law that would allow him to increase his holdings. But Laban had no intention of playing fairly. He cheated in a manner that would deprive Jacob of increasing the numbers of animals he could acquire. This time, though, Jacob outsmarted his father-in-law, resulting in his gaining massive wealth in the form of flocks and herds. That's verses 25 through 43 of chapter 30. Before long, Jacob realized that his position in Laban's extended family was no longer tenable. As well, the Lord appeared to Jacob and told him that it was time to go back to Canaan. That's in verse 1 of chapter 31. Preparing for this return, Jacob went to his two primary wives, Rachel and Leah. The order in which the women are named is hardly accidental. Jacob's partiality is indicated by the order of the names. In any case, he tells his wives that his relationship with their father has become strained. Among other things, Jacob complained that Laban had, quote, changed my wage 10 times, end of quote, a polite way of saying that Laban had cheated him every chance he had. Leah and Rachel agreed with their husband, noting that their relationship with their father was also strained. At that point, they gathered up their animals, their servants, their children, and their property, and set out for the land of Canaan. That's in verses 2 through 18 of chapter 31. As this party left, we are told an interesting tidbit. Rachel stole her father's household gods. No one else in the family knew this, including Jacob. That's in verse 19 of chapter 31. Before long, this act would threaten not only Rachel, but Jacob and his family. Jacob and his family, not to mention their extensive holdings, had a 3-day head start before Laban realized what had happened. He had been outwitted by his son-in-law. That's in verse 20 of chapter 31. It took Laban 7 days to catch up with this fleeing group. In the meantime, God had appeared to Laban and told him that he was not to harm Jacob or anyone in Jacob's party. That's in verses 23 and 24. When Laban reached Jacob, they had an argument, but in light of the divine revelation, no violence ensued. However, Laban could not countenance that his household gods had been stolen. Jacob did not know that Rachel was the culprit. So Jacob invited Laban to search the camp, promising to execute on the spot anyone who was discovered to be the thief. Laban searched until the only ones left to be searched were Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. After searching Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, only Rachel was left. Laban searched her tent and found nothing. But Rachel had hidden the gods in a camel's saddle and was sitting on that saddle in the tent. Laban was about to search the saddle. But at that point, Rachel asked her father to excuse her for not getting up. She pointed out that she was having her period, and rising would have been uncomfortable. Laban stopped his search when he heard this personal information. The gods were not discovered, and Rachel was no longer in danger. The march toward Canaan would continue. After Jacob's family returned to Canaan, once more Rachel conceived. Somewhere between Bethel and Ephrath, she went into labor and delivered her baby. Unfortunately, she died while giving birth. Still, before she died, she was able to name the child, as had been the custom in this family. Rachel named this son Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. For the first time, though, Jacob had a say in the naming. He named his 12th son and 13th child Benjamin, which means son of the right hand or son of the south. That's in verses 16 through 21 of chapter 35. Keep in mind the importance of Benjamin's birth. He was the child that was absolutely crucial in the later Joseph story. Had he not been around, Joseph would not have been able to spare his family and give them safe passage in Egypt. In the end, Rachel's 2 sons were strategic in the future of the elect people of God. Every woman in this story was important: Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, as well as Rachel. In Providence's strange ways, however, Rachel was just a little more important. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is. And if you have a question you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.